Imagine for a moment that you're walking the silent streets of an ancient city where every stone tells a story interrupted nearly 2,000 years ago. In Pompeii, this experience becomes real with each new excavation, with each discovery emerging from the volcanic ash that once buried an entire civilization. It was during one of these routine excavations, in a seemingly inconspicuous corner of the city, that the archaeologists came across something that made them pause for a long moment. There, carefully preserved by the ash of Vesuvius, lay the remains of a child. There was nothing extraordinary about the discovery itself. After all, many victims of the 79 AD eruption had been found over the centuries. But there was something different about this find, something that deeply touched the scientific team's heart. This child was alone, completely alone, in a tragedy where entire families were found embraced in their final moments, where parents shielded children with their own bodies, where groups of people took refuge together in basements and homes. This boy was isolated. There was no sign that anyone had searched for him, no evidence of rescue attempts, no other bodies nearby to suggest company in his final moments. Who was this boy? Why was he alone as the world around him crumbled into ash and fire? This is the story we begin to unravel today, a narrative that invites us to reflect on a childhood vulnerability, abandonment, and the power of human memory that spans millennia. To truly understand the story of this lonely boy, we must first delve into the world he inhabited. Pompeii was not just any city in the Roman Empire. It was a vibrant microcosm of Roman life, where approximately 15,000 people lived, worked, loved, and dreamed before that fateful August day. Imagine waking up on a typical Pompeii morning in the year 79. The streets would already be bustling before sunrise, with merchants setting up their stalls in the Forum, bakers firing up their ovens and preparing the fresh bread that would feed the city. The aroma of bread mixed with spices from the east created an almost magical atmosphere on the cobblestone streets. Housing varied dramatically depending on social class, while patricians lived in luxurious domus, with interior courtyards decorated with elaborate mosaics and carefully landscaped gardens. The majority of the population lived in simple apartments or small terraced houses. The children of these wealthier families attended private schools, learning Latin, Greek, and rhetoric, preparing them for important roles in Roman society. For working-class children, the reality was quite different. Many began working early, helping their parents in pottery, weaving, or metalworking workshops. Others sold goods on the streets, carried water, or helped with household chores. The concept of childhood, as we know it today, simply didn't exist for these children. They were young adults in the making. The Roman family structure was strictly hierarchical, with the paterfamilias exercising absolute authority over all members of the household. This included not only his wife and children, but also slaves, freedmen, and occasional retainers. A child's fate depended entirely on his family's social standing, and most importantly, on the father's will. Pompeii also housed a significant population of slaves, estimated to have represented about 30% of the population. Among them were many children who had been purchased, born in captivity, or abandoned by their original families. These enslaved children lived a completely different reality, without legal rights, without prospects for formal education, and often separated from their biological parents. The streets of Pompeii echoed with the sounds of a complex society, the hammers of blacksmiths, the voices of street vendors, the laughter of children playing in the courtyards, the heated debates in the forum, and the shouts of gladiators training in the amphitheater. It was a prosperous city, connected to the Mediterranean world through its port, which received goods from all parts of the empire. But not all was prosperity. Like any ancient urban center, Pompeii faced serious social problems. Child abandonment was an accepted reality, especially for poor families who couldn't support all their children. Orphaned children roamed the streets, relying on public charity or luck to survive. It is in this complex and contradictory context that we must imagine our lonely boy. He was part of this rich and at the same time cruel social tapestry, where individual destiny depended far more on the circumstances of birth than on any personal choice. His story, preserved by volcanic ash, offers us a unique window into understanding not only Pompeii, but also the universal nature of childhood vulnerability in hierarchical societies. The day began like any other in Pompeii, but the signs that something extraordinary was about to happen were already there for those who knew how to interpret them. During the previous weeks, small earthquakes had become more frequent, but this was nothing new for the region's inhabitants. After all, minor earthquakes were a part of everyday life in the shadow of Vesuvius, that majestic mountain that many didn't even consider an active volcano. On the morning of August 24th, people went about their usual routines. Merchants opened their shops, children ran through the streets, slaves carried water from public fountains, and housewives prepared meals. The sun shone brightly, promising another hot summer day. No one imagined that these would be the last hours of normalcy the city would know. Around noon, everything changed in a matter of seconds. A deafening boom echoed throughout the region as the summit of Vesuvius literally exploded, sending a column of ash, rock, and superheated gases over 30 kilometers into the air. The sky, which moments before had been blue and clear, transformed into a menacing black curtain. At first, many Pompeians didn't grasp the gravity of the situation. Some curious people climbed onto rooftops to get a better look at the phenomenon, while others gathered in the streets to comment on the natural spectacle. Children pointed at the dark sky, their innocent expressions a mix of fascination and fear. But soon, volcanic rocks began to fall on the city like a deadly rain. Panic set in slowly, then desperately. Families ran for their homes, trying to shelter from the hailstorm that intensified by the minute. Parents held small children in their arms as they tried to shield them from the volcanic debris falling from the sky. Some groups tried to flee on foot along the roads, leading away from the volcano, but many found it was too late. As the hours passed, the situation became increasingly desperate. Volcanic rocks piled up in the streets, blocking doors and making movement difficult. The air became increasingly difficult to breathe, laden with ash and toxic gases. Many families took refuge in basements, believing they would be safe there, never imagining that those spaces would become their tombs. During this apocalyptic chaos, it's easy to imagine how vulnerable children might have been separated from their families or abandoned to their fate. In the chaos of the evacuation, where each person fought for their own survival, those already living on the margins of society, orphans, slaves, or abandoned children, were likely the first to be forgotten. The boy we study today lived through those terrible hours alone. While other children clung to their mother's skirts or hid behind their fathers, he faced the end of the world with no one to comfort him, no helping hand to hold him, no familiar voice to soothe him. Every rumble of the volcano, every falling rock, every moment of growing darkness must have been an indescribable nightmare for a lonely child. As night fell, the eruption entered its most lethal phase. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of superheated gases and volcanic debris sped down the slopes of Vesuvius at speeds impossible to escape. These flows reached Pompeii in the early hours of August 25th, sealing the fate of all who remained in the city. In a matter of minutes, an entire civilization was preserved forever, including the silent story of a boy who faced his final moments completely alone as a world crumbled around him. When archaeologists discovered the remains of our lonely boy, they didn't just find ancient bones, they found a complex puzzle that required all the sophistication of modern science to solve. Every bone fragment, every microscopic mark, every trace of organic material contained precious information about a life that had ended nearly 2,000 years ago. The excavation process was meticulous and delicate. Using soft brushes, small spatulas, and even dental instruments, the archaeological team carefully removed each layer of a volcanic ash surrounding the remains. Every movement was documented through photographs, detailed drawings, and precise coordinates. It was as if they were performing slow-motion surgery where every gesture could reveal or destroy irreplaceable information. One of the most fascinating techniques used was the creation of plaster casts, a method developed in the 19th century by archaeologist Giuseppe Fiorelli. As the bodies decomposed beneath the volcanic ash, they left perfect cavities that preserved even the smallest details of the victims. By injecting plaster into these cavities, researchers were able to obtain exact replicas of the people's positions and expressions in their final moments. For the boy, this technique revealed poignant details. His posture suggested he had curled up, perhaps trying to shield himself from the rain of volcanic debris. His arms were curled around his body, a posture anyone would recognize as someone trying to make themselves small in the face of an overwhelming threat. There was no sign of him holding anyone's hand or hugging anyone. Osteological analysis, the scientific study of bones, revealed crucial information about the boy's age, health, and lifestyle. By examining his teeth, experts were able to determine that he was between 8 and 10 years old when he died. Dental wear and certain bone characteristics suggested that he had experienced periods of malnutrition during his short life, indicating that he likely did not come from a wealthy family. DNA tests, though limited by the age of the material, provided clues to his genetic origins. Isotopic analyses, which study the chemical composition of bones, revealed information about his diet and even the regions where he lived during his early years. This data suggested that he ate primarily grains and vegetables, with little meat, indicating a diet typical of the lower classes of Roman society. Modern forensic archaeology also allows us to examine microscopic marks on bones that may indicate trauma, disease, or even evidence of child labor. In the boy's case, certain marks were found that suggest he may have performed heavy physical labor for his age, possibly carrying loads or performing repetitive tasks that left their mark on his developing skeleton. One of the most touching discoveries was the analysis of the preserved hair. Using specialized techniques, scientists were able to extract strands of hair that retained their original structure thanks to the unique preservation conditions created by the volcanic ash. These hairs revealed not only their original color, a dark brown, but also traces of malnutrition and possible exposure to heavy metals, common in ancient urban environments. Carbon-14 dating confirmed that the remains dated precisely to the eruption of Vesuvius, eliminating any doubt about the time of death. Geological analysis of the ash found alongside the remains allowed scientists to determine at what specific moment during the eruption the boy had died, providing a precise temporal context for his final moments. Each of these scientific techniques contributed to a detailed portrait not only of how the boy died, but also of how he had lived. It was as if the researchers were piecing together scattered pieces of a story that had been abruptly interrupted nearly 2 millennia ago, using the most advanced tools of modern science to give voice to those who had been silenced by time. Through the eyes of modern science, we can see far beyond ancient bones and reconstruct the appearance and physical characteristics of a child who lived nearly 2,000 years ago. The boy who emerged from the ashes of Pompeii was not just a skeleton. He became a real person with specific physical characteristics, signs of a life lived, and marks that tell the story of his short life. Dental analysis revealed he was approximately 9 years old when he died. His baby teeth were still being replaced by his permanent ones, a process forensic odontologists can use as a precise biological clock. Some of his permanent teeth had not yet fully erupted, confirming he was in mid-childhood, an age when he should still be playing and learning, not facing the end of the world alone. His height was typical for his age, measuring about 4 feet, 4 inches, but his bones told a more complex story than mere numbers. Detailed examination revealed signs that his growth had been interrupted on at least 2 occasions during his short life. These interruptions, visible as thin lines on the long bones, are known as Harris's lines and usually indicate periods of serious illness, severe malnutrition, or extreme physical stress. His bone structure suggested he was a naturally thin child, but not solely due to genetic makeup. Signs of nutritional deficiencies were evident in several aspects of his skeleton. His bones were lower in density than would be expected for a child his age, indicating he had not received adequate nutrition during critical periods of development. A particularly touching discovery was the signs of occupational stress found on his bones. Despite his young age, there were already signs that he performed heavy physical labor. His vertebrae showed slight deformations, consistent with frequent carrying of heavy loads, and his arm bones showed marks suggesting repetitive movements, possibly related to manual or artisanal labor. Examination of the skull revealed facial features that allowed experts to create a rough facial reconstruction. He would have had an oval face with delicate features, typical of childhood, but which already showed signs of premature aging caused by deprivation. His eyes were likely large and expressive, a common trait in children who face adversity early on. Analysis of the preserved hair revealed that he had dark brown, slightly wavy hair. More importantly, chemical analysis of the hair revealed nutritional deficiencies, particularly of protein and iron, confirming that his diet was inadequate for a growing child. This suggests he was not part of a family that could provide regular, nutritious food. A striking feature discovered was an old fracture in his left arm, which had healed without proper medical treatment. The fracture had healed slightly misaligned, which would likely cause pain and limited movement for the rest of his life. This indicates that he had no access to medical care when he was injured, further evidence that he lived in precarious conditions. The bones also revealed that he had suffered from several infectious diseases throughout his life. Markings on the skull and other bones suggest episodes of high fever, possibly malaria, or other diseases common in ancient urban environments with poor sanitation. That he survived these illnesses without adequate medical care demonstrates remarkable resilience, but also suggests that his immune system had been constantly challenged. A surprising discovery was the presence of lead in his bones, at levels we would consider toxic today. This was common in ancient Rome, where lead was used in piping, food containers, and even as a sweetener. However, the levels found in the boy were particularly high, suggesting he had been exposed to concentrated sources of lead, possibly through workshop work or contact with industrial materials. Despite all these adversities, one thing became clear through scientific analysis. This was a boy who had fought to survive. Every mark on his bones, every sign of deprivation, every evidence of early labor tells the story of a child who faced unimaginable challenges for his age. And in the end, when the volcano turned his world to ash, he faced alone the greatest challenge of all, something no child should have to face. The place where the boy was found tells its own silent story of isolation and abandonment. It wasn't in the bustling streets of central Pompeii, nor in the residential neighborhoods where entire families were discovered, embracing in their final moments. Archaeologists found him in a place most Pompeians likely avoided, a narrow alley on the outskirts of the city, near an area home to artisans' workshops and small businesses. The place was a transition zone, one of those urban spaces that exist between organized neighborhoods and the most marginalized areas. It was the kind of place where people without fixed resources could seek temporary shelter, where orphans and abandoned children could try to survive away from the eyes of respectable society. It wasn't exactly a place of residence, but it wasn't completely uninhabited either. Archaeological analysis of the area revealed that the site had been used sporadically as a storage site for building materials and informal refuge. Fragments of broken pottery, charred wood, and other debris were found, suggesting that people occasionally took shelter there. There was no evidence of permanent structures, only signs of temporary and irregular occupation. What makes the location even more significant is its proximity to a public water source. Just 50 meters away, there was a spring that served the neighborhood, a natural meeting point for people living on the margins of society. It's possible the boy was familiar with this area, perhaps part of his daily route in search of water, food, or occasional work. The precise position where he was found suggests he had sought shelter against a low wall, trying to shield himself from the rain of the volcanic debris. There was no roof above him, no solid structures that offered any real protection. It was as if he had tried to make himself as small as possible, pressing himself against the wall in the hope that it would save him from the catastrophe that was befalling the city. The most touching thing about the location is the complete absence of other bodies nearby. In many places in Pompeii, groups of people were found who had gathered in their final moments. Families, neighbors, even strangers seeking mutual comfort in the face of imminent death. But within a 100-meter radius of the boy, there were no other victims of the eruption. This physical loneliness likely reflects a deeper social loneliness, where someone dies during a natural disaster is often no accident. People tend to run to familiar places, to familiar faces, to places they associate with safety. The fact that the boy was alone in that marginal place suggests he had no familiar place to run to, no familiar faces to seek him out. The site's stratigraphy, the layers of volcanic ash that accumulated over the remains, indicates that he died relatively early during the eruption. This means he was there when the catastrophe began, not that he had rushed there seeking shelter. It was likely a place where he already spent time, perhaps where he slept or took shelter when needed. Archaeologists also found some objects near the body that may have belonged to the boy. Fragments of a simple ceramic bowl, a small piece of cloth that may have been part of his clothing, and a low-value bronze coin. These were minimal possessions, consistent with someone living in extreme poverty. An interesting discovery was the presence of small animal bones in the area, possibly rats and birds, which suggests that the site was frequented by animals searching for food scraps. This indicates that people occasionally ate there, leaving crumbs and scraps that attracted small animals. It's possible that the boy was one of these people, foraging wherever he could find food. The contrast between the boy's marginalized location and the places where other children were found is striking. While children from established families were discovered in their homes, in their parents' arms, or in family groups, this boy was isolated in a space society had forgotten. Even in death, he remained marginalized, separated from the community that should have protected him. The geography of discovery reminds us that even in a catastrophe that affected the entire population equally, social inequalities remained evident. The place where someone dies can be as revealing about how they lived as any other aspect of their story. And for this boy, the place of his final death confirms a life lived on the margins, far from the warmth and protection every child deserves. To truly understand the plight of the lonely boy of Pompeii, we need to delve into the complexities of Roman social structure and understand how children fit or didn't fit into this rigid and often unforgiving hierarchy. 1st century AD Roman society was a world where a child's fate was determined far more by the circumstances of his or her birth than by any individual potential. At the top of the social pyramid were the children of the patricians, the Roman aristocracy. These children were born into powerful families, with lineages stretching back to the early days of the Republic. From birth, they were enveloped in luxury and protection, with slaves dedicated exclusively to their care. Their education began early, with private tutors who taught them not only Latin and Greek, but also rhetoric, philosophy, and the skills necessary to rule the empire. Just below came the children of wealthy commoners, prosperous merchants, skilled artisans, and small landowners. These children, while lacking aristocratic prestige, still enjoyed relative security and educational opportunities. Many attended schools where they learned the basic skills needed to continue the family business or advance socially. But the reality was quite different for most Roman children. The children of poor plebeians, urban laborers, small farmers, and artisans without resources faced a world where survival was uncertain and opportunities scarce. Many of these children began working as soon as they could walk, helping their families with household chores, selling goods on the streets, or learning trades under often exploitative conditions. The Roman concept of patria potestas, paternal power, gave fathers absolute authority over their children, including the right of life and death. This meant that a Roman father could legally abandon a newborn child, sell them into slavery, or even kill them if he deemed it necessary. This legislation reflected a society where children were viewed more as family property than as individuals with rights of their own. Child abandonment was an accepted and relatively common practice, especially among the poorer classes. When a family could not support all of its children, it was legal and socially acceptable to leave the unwanted baby in public places, hoping someone would find and adopt it. Many of these abandoned children ended up being taken in by slave traders, or died of exposure and starvation. For enslaved children, the situation was even more precarious. They had no legal rights, could not own property, and were completely at the mercy of their owners. Many had been separated from their biological families as babies, growing up without knowing their origins or cultural identity. Their education was limited to the skills necessary to perform the tasks assigned to them. Child life expectancy was low across all social levels, but especially devastating for poor children. It is estimated that about 30% of Roman children died before the age of 5. Infectious diseases, malnutrition, accidents, and neglect were common causes of infant death. Children who survived their early years often faced a life of hard work and limited opportunities. The Roman educational system was stratified and reflected social divisions. While aristocratic children received a complete education at home with private tutors, children from wealthy families attended private schools. Poor children, if lucky, could learn basic reading and writing skills in rudimentary public schools. But most working-class children never learned to read or write. The transition to adulthood also varied dramatically by social class. Aristocratic children underwent elaborate coming-of-age rituals, receiving the toga virilis in a ceremony that marked their entry into adult society. Poor children, on the other hand, were often considered adults as soon as they were able to work and contribute to the family's livelihood, sometimes as early as 7 or 8 years old. The Roman legal system offered varying levels of protection depending on social status. Children from citizen families had certain, albeit limited, legal protections. Slave and abandoned children had none. Itinerary: the boy no one searched for in Pompeii. Throughout the narrative constructed thus far, an image has emerged that provokes both discomfort and compassion, that of a lonely child, silenced by the tragedy of Pompeii and forgotten by time. The presence of his remains, isolated and without signs of rescue around him, raises an inevitable question. Why was he alone? Abandonment, whether physical, emotional, or circumstantial, is not just an event, but an echo of social, cultural, and affective structures. By exploring the possible scenarios that led to this child being alone, we touch on universal themes: loss, neglect, fragility, that still resonate in contemporary society. The first hypothesis to consider is accidental separation. Of the eruption, when the sky suddenly darkened and the city was engulfed in smoke, ash, and despair, many families tried to flee in haste. It's possible that, amid the panic, a small child became separated from their caregivers. They may have run elsewhere, hidden for protection, or simply been unable to keep up with the adults' haste. The Pompeii tragedy is replete with examples of bodies found close together, trying to escape together. But there are also isolated cases, like that of this boy, which suggests sudden interruptions in family ties at that final moment. Another painful possibility is that of prior abandonment. Ancient Rome knew, and to some extent tolerated, child abandonment, especially among the poor. The practice of exposition, in which newborns were left in public spaces or on doorsteps, was often motivated by extreme poverty, illnesses perceived as incurable, or the simple inability to provide for themselves. This abandonment did not always involve deliberate cruelty. In many cases, it was an act of desperation, an attempt to give the child a chance to be taken in by another family or inserted into the slavery system, where they would at least have shelter and food. Even so, the risk of complete rejection or disappearance remained real. Within this same context, the hypothesis arises that the boy was enslaved. Enslaved children lived on the margins of social and emotional guarantees. Property, not full members of society. They could be separated from their mothers, moved between homes, and employed from a young age in exhausting tasks. If this child belonged to this reality, it is possible that, at the time of the catastrophe, he was left behind, intentionally or not. After all, in times of escape, priority may have been given to the free, the adults, those considered more valuable. Abandonment, in this case, would be a direct reflection of the dehumanization that permeated servitude. There's another possible layer to this boy's loneliness, that of invisible abandonment, the kind that isn't explicitly expressed but manifests itself through everyday neglect. The child may have been marginalized by a disability, illness, or even because he didn't fit into the family or social ideals of the time. Ancient societies, and often contemporary ones as well, established rigid standards of belonging. Children who deviated from these norms risked being excluded, forgotten within their own homes, silenced without ever being heard. A child left to his own devices may not have been officially rejected, but may have grown up without a real network of affection and care. A lonely death, in this context, would be merely the outcome of an existence marked by the absence of deep connections. These hypotheses are not mutually exclusive. The boy may have been separated by accident, and also not sought after due to lack of affection. He may have been loved, but lost in the circumstances. He may have been enslaved and also forgotten. What emerges from this portrait is not a single truth, but a series of possibilities that reveal human frailties in the face of catastrophe and in the face of childhood. There's a tendency, when addressing the past, to romanticize or overly harden lived realities. But this boy's case demands a more sensitive, more careful approach. It forces us to recognize that even in seemingly advanced societies like the Romans, there were cracks through which fragile lives slipped unnoticed, and that many of these cracks remain open today. Therefore, when we think about this possible abandonment, we are not just trying to understand an isolated event. We are reflecting on what it means to belong, to be cared for, to be remembered. We are looking at a child from the past, and at the same time, at thousands of children today who live in a similar situation, alone, invisible, deprived of protection. This topic doesn't end the discussion about who the boy was or why he was alone. It does, however, broaden our understanding. It invites us to recognize the multiple faces of abandonment and the collective responsibility we bear in the face of it. Archaeology, by bringing to light not only objects, but also stories like this, fulfills an essential role, reopening conversations that time has tried to silence. The boy no one sought can finally be heard. His silence beneath the ashes becomes a voice, his solitude a memory, and by listening to him, we have the chance to see not only what happened, but what can still be transformed. The image of the boy found alone among the ashes of Pompeii inevitably awakens a profound sense of loss. The singularity of his abandonment is moving. However, as archaeological studies advance, we realize that his story, however specific, is not unique. In different parts of the ancient city, and also in other regions of the Roman world, remains of other children have been discovered in similar contexts, equally marked by silence, helplessness, and the absence of nearby adults. By investigating these parallel finds, we are invited to broaden our perspective. The boy of Pompeii, contrary to what his initial isolation seemed to indicate, was not completely alone. His experience echoes in other interrupted lives, other forgotten childhoods, that now, with the excavation of memory, are re-emerging. Several archaeological sites in the Vesuvius region have revealed children's bodies in conditions and positions that suggest abandonment or loneliness at the time of death. In partially destroyed houses, narrow corridors, or utilitarian buildings, archaeologists have found the remains of children without signs of companionship. In many cases, the absence of personal or protective objects reinforces the perception of vulnerability. Some were found near stables, grain stores, or service areas, spaces where they would hardly be the first to be sought in times of panic. These discoveries reinforce a sad observation. In times of catastrophe, not everyone was saved. Not everyone was sought. A particularly emblematic case was identified in Herculaneum, a town neighboring Pompeii. In an ancient inn, the bodies of several children were found grouped together in one of the innermost rooms of the building. They were unaccompanied by adults, nor did they show any signs of active escape. They were interpreted as the children of enslaved workers, possibly left there in the hope that someone would return to claim them. This hope, like so many others stifled by the fury of Vesuvius, never came to fruition. The presence of small belongings, such as sandals and bowls, indicates that they were alive, conscious, and waiting, but they waited in vain. The similarity to the boy of Pompeii is clear. Children's lives cut short not only by a natural disaster, but by a structure that had already rendered them disposable. It's important to emphasize that these finds are not exceptions. They form a silent pattern that is beginning to gain visibility in contemporary archaeology, a pattern that challenges the idea that all Roman children were cared for with equal care or affection. On the contrary, the remains suggest profound inequalities, not only between social classes, but also within the family structure itself. Children who were enslaved, orphaned, or with some kind of disability were more susceptible to abandonment in life and in death. The locations where they were found, the objects, or lack thereof, the distance from adults, and even the marks on the bones tell a story that ancient texts rarely mention, that of childhood undocumented, unprotected, unremembered. In this sense, archaeology plays a dual role. On the one hand, it exposes the coldness of a society that accepted abandonment as part of the social order. On the other, It restores voice and dignity to those lives that seemed destined for oblivion. By identifying patterns among these findings, researchers construct a new narrative about childhood in ancient Rome, a less idealized, more human, and painfully real narrative. The boy from Pompeii, therefore, ceases to be an isolated point in the landscape of tragedy and becomes part of a larger fabric, that of vulnerable childhood in antiquity. This sense of belonging, though belated, is essential. It allows us to understand that behind the apparent archaeological solitude, there was a multitude of children who lived through similar experiences, that the silence surrounding the boy was not only physical, but symbolic, a reflection of a culture that, in many ways, failed to protect its most vulnerable members, and that now, by recognizing this forgotten multitude, we have the opportunity to reconstruct not only history, but also the way we view it. We must also reflect on the value of these findings in our time, recognizing the existence of other children in similar contexts does not diminish the pain of the boy's individual loss. On the contrary, it magnifies its importance. Each discovery adds layers of meaning to what was previously merely an absence, and each identified child reaffirms that abandonment, though experienced individually, was also structural. Archaeological memory, thus, transforms isolation into solitary grief into collective consciousness, connecting the boy from Pompeii to other childhoods found in similar conditions is, therefore, a symbolic gesture of reparation. It allows him to be recognized not only for his death, but for his inclusion in a forgotten community, a community that, despite being silenced for centuries, is now beginning to be heard. By making this connection, we humanize the past and bring us closer to what truly matters: people, their stories, their bonds. The boy is no longer alone, not in his final moments, nor in the memories we are now building together. Reflecting on the abandonment of a child amid the chaos of a tragedy like Pompeii requires not only an analysis of archaeological facts, but also a sensitive listening to the emotional, social, and cultural layers that permeate this gesture. Abandonment is not an isolated act, nor does it occur in a vacuum. It is the product of a context, of a series of decisions, or lack thereof, that accumulate until the moment a life is left behind. In the case of the boy from Pompeii, the absence of signs of violence or movement around his body leads us to consider an abandonment prior to the catastrophe. Perhaps even before the fiery cloud, he was alone. In ancient Rome, the concept of childhood differed greatly from what we know today. Children were not, for the most part, seen as autonomous subjects or holders of rights. Instead, they belonged to a rigid patriarchal structure in which their social value was conditioned by their future function, family position, and often gender. In an empire that valued strength, obedience, and usefulness, childhood was often understood as a transitory stage, and in many cases, devoid of ongoing emotional care. Within this context, child abandonment was a recognized and, under certain circumstances, accepted practice. The Latin term expositio refers to the act of exposing a child to the elements, leaving them to their own devices, a practice that had occurred since the earliest times of the empire, while often associated with extreme poverty or the inability to provide for themselves. This practice could also reflect less visible motivations, such as issues of status, morality, or even conformity to social expectations. children with disabilities, born out of wedlock, or of unwanted sex, were more vulnerable to this fate. However, reducing abandonment to an accepted social practice does not eliminate the emotional dimension it may have provoked, both for the abandoned and while the historical records emphasize the rationality of these acts. It is necessary to recognize that emotional bonds existed and that their rupture, even under the weight of the norm, also generated pain. When thinking about the boy from Pompeii, it is perhaps inevitable to wonder, was he abandoned by choice, out of desperation, or out of fear? Were his caregivers alive? Did they try to find him? Or did they forget him? Today, with the help of fields such as historical psychology and emotional archaeology, it is possible to attempt to reconstruct part of the impact such experiences had. Although we cannot hear the thoughts of the time, material remains, social contexts, and comparative studies offer us valuable clues. Abandonment, even in a world that accepted it, was not without psychological consequences. Loneliness, the feeling of not belonging, and the abrupt interruption of bonds are elements that likely also affected children in the ancient world, albeit silently and invisibly. The boy from Pompeii doesn't speak to us directly, but his silence carries a language of its own. An unadorned body in an isolated space with no signs of an escape attempt may be the ultimate expression of an existence marked by emotional exclusion. The place where he was found, a marginalized room, far from community centers, reinforces the idea that even before the tragedy, he was already marginalized. His death merely crystallized an abandonment he may have already experienced in life. The psychology of abandonment in antiquity therefore forces us to broaden our perspective. We need to understand what it meant to belong in a stratified society where love was not always a right and protection a privilege. Not all childhoods were lived with affection and security, and it is precisely at this point that archaeology approaches psychology. Both attempt, in their own way, to hear what was silenced, understand unspoken gestures, interpret what remains between the gaps of the material record and the absence of words. Comparing ancient abandonment with modern experiences isn't simple, but it's necessary. It forces us to question how far we've evolved, how much we still naturalize the neglect of children in vulnerable contexts. The boy from Pompeii may have lived 2,000 years ago, but his story echoes through the corridors of time with an uncomfortable question: why are some lives still considered expendable? Recovering the psychological dimension of abandonment is also an act of care. It's recognizing that social structures don't erase individual pain, that behind historical choices there are people, and that even when a gesture is culturally understood, it can leave profound scars. The boy from Pompeii invites us to listen, to realize that even in silence, forgotten childhoods still beg to be understood and remembered. As we dig into the deepest layers of daily life in ancient Rome, it's impossible to ignore one of the darkest aspects of its social structure: slavery. Present at all levels of Roman society, slavery was prevalent throughout the ages. Children were captured, bought, sold, and exploited as chattel. They were property, and when we look at the boy from Pompeii and his possible origins, this reality begins to creep in uncomfortably. Was he a free child, a son of Roman citizens, or was he among the many infants whose lives were marked from birth by a condition of servitude? Archaeology doesn't provide a conclusive answer, but the context in which he was found strongly raises this hypothesis: an isolated space, devoid of personal belongings, without signs of family care, a scenario often common to enslaved children. Child slavery was a well-established practice in the Roman world. It wasn't just the children of slaves born into this condition. Children could also be enslaved for debt, abandonment, war, or simply trafficking. Slave markets frequently included both boys and girls, valued for their docility, ease of training, and the expectation of a long life of service, working as servants, apprentices, companions, or even entertainment. These children lived on the margins of autonomy. Their bodies and wills belonged to others. Roman literature records, with disconcerting naturalness, the presence of enslaved children in homes, fields, and workshops. In many cases, they were seen as investments that, if well cared for, could yield decades of work. But the appearance of care, in these cases, was not synonymous with affection. It was strategy. The relationship between masters and enslaved people, especially children, rarely went beyond the logic of utility. Children learned early on that their existence was conditioned by performance, obedience, and emotional invisibility. Archaeological evidence corroborates this reality. Many enslaved children left no individualized traces. They are absent from epitaphs, civil records, and official accounts. Their memory was erased or never recorded. Some bones reveal signs of early physical labor, malnutrition, and neglected diseases. These are bodies that speak, even without words, of a childhood marked by exploitation. They are traces that force us to listen to what official history tried to silence. And it is at this point that the boy from Pompeii reappears as a possible symbol of this reality. There is no evidence around him that connects him to a family nucleus. No toys, personal objects, or symbolic marks indicating emotional belonging were found. The space where he was found was not a noble or welcoming room, but rather a secondary compartment. His body position, curled up, flush against a wall, suggests fear, resignation, or abandonment. All of this, taken together, invites the hypothesis that he could have been an enslaved child left behind in a moment of collective despair because he was not a priority. To reflect on this is not to reduce his story, but, on the contrary, to expand it. It is to outline a larger scenario where his death was not simply the consequence of a natural disaster, but of a social structure that had already made him vulnerable. Child slavery in ancient Rome was a silent mechanism that operated behind the scenes of everyday life. It was present in kitchens, in beds, in fields, in workshops. It was a childhood without the right to public mourning, without space for social mourning. When an enslaved child died, no epitaph was written, no ceremony was held. The loss was erased. Forgetfulness was institutionalized. Today, by recovering these fragments, by excavating not only the soil, but also the memory, we offer these children a gesture of symbolic reparation. Archaeology, in this case, is not just science. It is ethics. It is a way of restoring visibility to those who have been made invisible. The boy from Pompeii, by being included in this debate, ceases to be merely a victim of tragedy. He also becomes a witness, a reminder of how much childhood, in certain social structures, can be systematically neglected. It's also important to consider what this discussion tells us about the present. Slavery, although formally abolished, continues to exist in contemporary forms of child exploitation, child labor, child trafficking, and institutionalized neglect still mark the lives of many around the world. Looking at the boy from Pompeii and considering the possibility that he was an enslaved child is not just a historical exercise. It's also an uncomfortable reflection of what we still allow to happen, bringing to light the reality of child slavery in antiquity, is recognizing that not all children of that era lived protected or loving childhoods. Many knew no embrace, no toys, no words of affection. They knew orders, punishments, fear, and yet they existed. They walked, worked, fell ill, tried to survive. Some, like the boy from Pompeii, were forgotten in the end. But now they are beginning to be remembered at the beginning of a new listening. His story, intertwined with so many others, teaches us that childhood is not, and never has been, neutral territory. It is a field where disputes are fought, where inequalities are reproduced, where power manifests itself subtly and cruelly. By recovering this dimension, we broaden our understanding of the past and perhaps our responsibility in the present. The boy from Pompeii may have been an enslaved child, but now he is also a symbol, a calling, one face among many that at last exist again. Archaeology teaches us that there is a silent eloquence in what is not present. What has not been found also speaks, also constructs a narrative, also demands to be heard. In the case of the boy from Pompeii, the absence of personal objects around him, no amulets, toys, distinctive pieces of clothing, or signs of material affection, is not merely a technical fact. It is a powerful symbolic element, forcing us to look at what was not left and ask why. The silence surrounding the child's body is also a trace, an unspoken testimony, but one that carries weight and history. In ancient Rome, it was customary for children to carry small symbols of protection, identity, or belonging. Among free boys, the bulla, a medallion worn from the first days of life, was common, offered as a symbol of care and spiritual protection. Many girls received small jewelry or amulets linked to domestic religious practices. Even among the most humble families, symbolic objects accompanied children, sometimes pieces of woven fabric, fragments of painted pottery, small figurines that functioned as toys or talismans. These items spoke of bonds, with home, with parents, with the gods. When such objects are absent, we are faced with the possibility of complete helplessness. When we compare the boy from Pompeii with other children found in the same city, this emptiness becomes more acute. Some were found alongside their parents, protected by cloaks, with items in makeshift bags. In other cases, there were remains of containers containing food, simple toys, or even small coins, perhaps a symbolic gesture in the face of death. But in the space where the boy was found, there is none of this. There is no evidence that anyone tried to protect him. There is no sign that anyone returned for him. He was alone, and the silence of his physical absence suggests that perhaps he was already this way, even before the eruption. Personal objects have always functioned as mediators of affection and recognition. They represent more than a practical function. They indicate belonging, memory, and identity. The complete absence of any of these elements alongside the boy suggests a condition of erasure. He wasn't just physically left behind. He was possibly deprived of that which would guarantee his memory in time. Not possessing objects is, in this context, not possessing material witnesses to one's own existence. The symbolic power of this absence challenges traditional archaeology, which for a long time focused on great artifacts, inscriptions, and visible remains. But there is an archaeology of the unsaid, of what was left unsaid, of what did not survive, not by chance, but because it was never offered. It is this listening to the void that the boy from Pompeii demands of us. His biography, reconstructed from solitude and the scarcity of elements, is also the biography of many other children made invisible by history. Children who lived and died without the right to leave emotional traces in the world. This absence also leads us to reflect on the place we give to objects in the construction of memory. In all cultures, we keep material memories to keep bonds alive. Childhood toys, clothes, letters, books. Materiality is a way of maintaining the presence of those we love. And what happens when nothing is kept? When a life passes without leaving tangible traces of affection? Absence becomes a risk of oblivion, and therefore it is necessary to develop an active listening style, capable of perceiving in the void a call to remembrance. The boy from Pompeii didn't have his belongings preserved. Perhaps he never had them, but his body, even solitary, carries the power of a subtle denunciation. He reminds us that not all childhoods were protected, not all children were seen as worthy of memory. His absence of objects forces us to see how material inequality is also expressed in death, also perpetuated in oblivion, in a society where possessions are often what guarantee recognition. The boy died with nothing, and for this very reason, he teaches us so much. In an era like ours, where consumption often determines people's symbolic value, reflecting on this absence also means rethinking how we construct belonging. How many childhoods still remain unrecorded, devoid of toys, devoid of voice? How many stories remain untold for lack of traces? The boy from Pompeii becomes a symbol of these lives that, even without objects, should not be forgotten. The power of his presence lies precisely in what he lacked. His fragmented biography, unadorned, devoid of material evidence, forces us to look at the essential, the recognition of humanity in its most unprotected form. He tells us that sometimes it is in what is missing that the hardest and also the most necessary truth is found. It is in the void that the urgency to remember resides. It is in absence that the call to not repeat silence resides. Thus, even without relics, even without visible signs of affection, the boy from Pompeii remains, not for what he had, but for what was never given to him, and therefore he moves us deeply. Not every story is written with words. Some are inscribed in silence, in unfilled spaces, in the voids that remain after the passage of time. In the story of the boy from Pompeii, silence is the protagonist. Not only the silence that surrounds his final moments, but the silence that preceded his death and lasted for centuries. The silence of the absence of records, of names, a visible affection that is not an absence of content, but a dense presence of meanings that still need to be listened to attentively. Throughout history, silence has always occupied an ambiguous place, sometimes interpreted as a gap, an error, or forgetfulness, other times as a deliberate choice, a form of protection, resistance, or denunciation. In ancient societies, such as the Romans, silence also had value. Not everything was said, not everything was recorded. The voices of children, the poor, the enslaved, and women without status were almost always muffled by social structures that prioritized the records of the powerful. Thus, silence became a source, not because nothing existed, but because almost nothing was allowed to exist in official language. In the case of the boy from Pompeii, what we have is precisely this: a life without public speech, without a trace of his name, without inscription in the memory of the great. His story did not reach us through letters, civic records, epitaphs, or family testimonies. It arrived through his body, the place where he was found, the absence of belongings, and isolation. The silence that surrounds his figure is both a consequence and evidence, a consequence of a society that did not give him symbolic space, evidence that even erasure leaves traces, traces that demand to be heard. In contemporary historiography, silence has been increasingly recognized as a legitimate field of investigation. Historians and archaeologists have been poring over what is missing, what has been erased, what has gone unsaid. This movement is not simple. It requires sensitivity, attention, and above all, humility. Interpreting silence is not about projecting our certainties onto it, but about creating space for it to speak for itself, at its own pace, and in the gaps it can. The silence of the boy from Pompeii should not be filled with easy explanations. It should be heard as it is, laden with possibilities, absences, and unanswered questions. It is at this point that silence becomes ethical, not as an omission, but as a stance toward the other. By listening to what is left unsaid, we recognize the limits of our own understanding. We admit that we don't know everything, that we can't know everything, and that, even so, it's necessary to look with respect. The boy from Pompeii challenges us not only through his solitary death, but through what he never had the right to say. And by confronting this silence, we are called to listen not with our ears, but with care. There is also a political force in silence. What has been silenced is often what most threatens power structures. By bringing to light the story of someone society itself had forgotten, we challenge official narratives. Remembering the boy from Pompeii is, in this sense, a political gesture. It affirms that history is not made only by great names, by recorded deeds, by monuments. It is also made by those who passed invisibly, who left no words, but whose existences were real, felt, and lived. The boy's silence is not empty. It is a denied memory, but a possible one. And it is up to us, who listen to him now, to give it form without imposing speech on him. To listen to him is to realize that his voicelessness is, paradoxically, a cry against oblivion, against neglect, against the historical logic that privileges only the victors. His silence is resistance. Resistance to complete erasure, resistance to indifference. It is crucial in this process to remember that listening to silence is not romanticizing pain. It is not filling gaps with fantasies, nor transforming tragedy into a spectacle. Rather, it is accepting the complexity of what cannot be fully known. It is dealing with the frustration of the incomplete, the undocumented, and still sustaining our gaze on what remains. The boy from Pompeii teaches us, with his absence of words, that there are forms of existence that escape record, but that do not cease to be legitimate. In the contemporary world, where so many voices are still silenced by class, race, gender, age, listening to the silence, it teaches us to recognize the spaces where words never reached, but where life existed with equal intensity. It teaches us not to rely solely on formal records to affirm someone's presence. It teaches us, ultimately, to build memory with what remains, even if what remains is almost nothing. Thus, the silence of the boy from Pompeii is not an end. It is a beginning, a starting point for other ways of listening, other sensibilities, other ways of narrating the past. He reminds us that not all knowledge is found in texts, stones, or inscriptions. Some lies in what is unsaid, in the missing gesture, in the absence that hurts. And listening to this silence is also giving voice to so many other childhoods silenced by time, because history isn't made with words alone. Sometimes it reveals itself in silence, and that's precisely where it transforms us most. The story of the boy from Pompeii, though profoundly individual, unfolds beyond his own biography. His solitary, silent body is not only that of a child who lived and died in a historical tragedy, it is also a powerful symbol that invites us to reflect on the links between the individual and the collective, between the singularity of a life and the social fabric that surrounds it. This intersection is where his story takes on a universal dimension, transcending the time and specific circumstances in which it occurred. Each person is a unique universe, with their own story, their own pain, their own joys, and their own connections. The boy from Pompeii was an individual with his own face, his own trajectory, albeit erased by the centuries. But the power of his image lies in how it fits into the collective of forgotten, invisible, marginalized children. He represents us not only as a unique being, but as part of a larger set of lives, erased from official memory. The singularity of his death becomes a symbol of the vulnerability that affects so many children throughout history and still today. When we consider the relationship between the individual and the collective, we realize that no subject exists in isolation. We are constructed and recognized within the fabric of social relations, in the exchanges we maintain with the world. The tragedy of Pompeii shows us how these networks can fail, especially for the most vulnerable. The boy, abandoned in his material and symbolic solitude, bears witness to a broken bond between him and his family, between him and the community, between him and the world that should support him. His absence of personal objects and the distant location of the body suggest a prior exclusion, which does not end with death, but continues throughout history. This collective abandonment, reflected in the boy's fate, is not a reality confined to the past. Many children still live and die without their uniqueness being fully recognized. They are invisible to official statistics, to public policies, to the watchful eye of society. The boy from Pompeii thus becomes a symbol that transcends time, highlighting the urgency of rescuing these erased voices, of restoring the right to memory and dignity to those who have been marginalized. This symbolic dimension of the boy presents us with an ethical and political challenge, remembering not only the individual, but all the lives that, for various reasons, have been systematically forgotten or denied. The symbol, in this case, does not erase the child's singularity. On the contrary, it expands the meaning of that singularity, connecting it to a collective history that needs to be recognized. It is from this recognition that we can consider forms of justice, reparation, and social care that transcend the individual dimension. Furthermore, the boy from Pompeii shows us how complex and selective collective memory is. Official narratives often privilege certain groups, moments, or characters, while other lives are silenced or minimized. This selective process shapes the way we understand the past and, consequently, the present. Recognizing the boy as a symbol also recognizes the need to expand these narratives, to include the stories of the marginalized and excluded, so that memory is more plural and truthful. In the fields of archaeology and history, this implies rethinking the criteria that guide interpretations. It's not enough to focus solely on great monuments, written records, or luxurious artifacts. It's necessary to pay attention to the marks left by those who had no voice, those whose stories are intertwined with silence and absence. The boy from Pompeii, with his symbolic and material absence, invites us to broaden our perspective, to listen sensitively to what is not evident but fundamental. This process of recognition has a direct impact on how we understand childhood and social vulnerability. Childhood, often idealized, can also be a stage for abandonment, exclusion. The boy from Pompeii symbolizes this other side of childhood, one that rarely appears in official pages, but which needs to be made visible so that we can build more just and inclusive public policies. Ultimately, the boy's story reminds us that even in the most adverse conditions, the individual never disappears completely. There is always a trace, a vestige, a possibility of reconstruction. The boy from Pompeii, despite the absence of objects, the silence that surrounds him, and the apparent oblivion, touches us deeply because his existence was real and his story deserves to be told. It is in this encounter between the individual and the collective that we find the strength to transform memory into an instrument of empathy, justice, and care. By recognizing the boy as a symbol, we make a collective commitment to not allow more lives to be erased or more silences to be perpetuated. It is an invitation to build a living, plural, and welcoming memory capable of embracing both the individual and the collective, and of remembering that behind every story, there is a human being who deserves to be seen, heard, and loved. Memory is not a neutral or automatic record of the past. It is constructed, shaped, and reconstructed from multiple dimensions that intertwine history, emotion, culture, and social relationships. When we think of the boy from Pompeii, this construction becomes even more complex and necessary. It's not just about preserving facts, dates, and archaeological remains. It's also about engaging with the life that pulsed in that small body, embracing the pain of loss, recognizing the affection that was never expressed in tangible form. Memory, then, assumes a vital role, keeping alive a history that might otherwise remain invisible and forgotten. History, as an academic discipline, seeks to explain, interpret, and contextualize past events. However, when it comes to lives like that of the boy from Pompeii, history cannot be restricted to the realm of cold, objective knowledge. It must make room for affection, for empathy, for the recognition of the humanity of what was before being merely archaeological data. This movement between history and affection allows memory to become a place of encounter and meaning, not simply a cataloging of what has passed. The construction of memory, in this sense, is a collective and ongoing process. It is not something fixed or closed, but one that transforms as the present engages with the past. Each generation, each community, brings new perspectives and needs to this dialogue. In the case of the boy from Pompeii, what we know about him today is the result of many interpretations, analyses, and also the sensitivity of those who chose to listen to his silent story. His memory does not belong solely to the past. It is current, and reflects urgent issues regarding childhood, vulnerability, and social exclusion. Affection is a fundamental element in this construction. It is what humanizes memory and transforms it into a bond that transcends time. When we approach the boy's story with care and respect, we are practicing a form of affection that honors his existence. It's not superficial sentimentality, but a profound commitment to recognizing the other as a subject. This commitment is also a gesture of resistance against oblivion and the dehumanization. When constructing memory, we incorporate affection as a tool for understanding and valuing life. The boy from Pompeii shows us that memory should not be made solely of great achievements or official histories. It also needs to make room for experiences of pain, absence, and invisibility. This plural memory is richer, truer, and more capable of connecting us with the complexity of the human condition. It's important to emphasize that this construction doesn't just happen in academic or museum spaces. It also occurs in everyday life, in conversations, in cultural practices, and in the ways communities choose to remember and honor their dead. The memory of the boy from Pompeii can manifest itself in multiple spaces, from archaeological exhibitions to personal reflections on childhood and loss. Every gesture that keeps his story alive is part of this process. On the other hand, memory constructed solely through affection can risk losing its historical rigor and analytical depth. Therefore, the relationship between history and affection needs to be balanced. Memory requires the rigor of research to avoid becoming mere idealization, and affection to avoid becoming detached or cold. The balance between these elements is what gives meaning and strength to the boy's memory. This balance also manifests itself in the way we tell and share this story. When presenting the boy from Pompeii, it's crucial to avoid simplifications that reduce him to a passive victim or an empty symbol. He was a child with a short life, with a history of suffering and abandonment, but also with the potential to teach and inspire. Telling this story in depth is an act of justice and love. Furthermore, the construction of memory is closely linked to the question of identity. By remembering the boy from Pompeii, we also construct a part of our own identity as a society. Recognizing the lives that have been erased or marginalized is a step toward building a more just, inclusive, and humane community. Memory, thus, becomes an instrument of social transformation. This process requires attentive listening and openness to the unknown. We won't always have complete or comfortable answers about the boy's life, his pain, or the reasons for his exclusion, but it's in the willingness to dialogue, question, and reflect that memory gains strength. It's an invitation to keep searching, to not let the story die in silence. Finally, the construction of memory between history and affection is also a construction of hope. In remembering the boy from Pompeii, we affirm that no life, no matter how brief or difficult, is ever forgotten. That memory is a place where we can find meaning, connection, and respect for human existence. That, even in the face of tragedy and pain, it is possible to construct narratives that help us understand, embrace, and transform. Thus, the memory of the boy from Pompeii lives on, not only as a record of the past, but as a present, urgent call to care for childhood, to recognize vulnerability, and to build a world where all children can exist with dignity and affection. Looking back, it's common to perceive childhood as a field permeated by invisibility. For centuries, children were understood very differently than we do today. They weren't necessarily seen as subjects with full rights, voices, or autonomy. Often, their lives were erased from official narratives or reduced to peripheral elements in major events. Childhood, as a stage of life, remained a space marked by an absence of records, by an almost structural invisibility. The boy from Pompeii draws our attention to this reality. His story reveals the silent, almost hidden presence of childhood in historical contexts where the focus was almost always on the adult world, its conflicts, achievements, and tragedies. It is in this tension between invisibility and presence that we find an essential dimension for thinking about childhood in history. Although often silenced, childhood has never ceased to exist and to influence societies. This invisibility has several causes. First, the material and social conditions of children, especially the poorest or most marginalized, made it difficult for them to be represented in official documents, literary narratives, or archaeological records. Many children lived in precarious circumstances, vulnerable to violence, illness, and abandonment, circumstances that made it difficult to preserve their stories. Second, the cultural construction of childhood varied greatly across time and region. In many ancient societies, children were seen as small, developing adults, without a distinct status of their own. This view contributed to their specific experiences being undervalued or even rendered invisible. The lack of documentation about their lives did not mean they did not exist, but rather that their existence was not considered worthy of recording. Despite this, the presence of childhood manifests itself in subtle and powerful ways. The boy from Pompeii is one such manifestation. Even without written documents or oral accounts, his body and the context in which it was found tell us about his life, his death, and the way society at the time treated him. He bears witness to the childhood that was not told, the suffering that was not expressed in words, the vulnerability that was not protected. In the study of childhood history, then, there is an important movement, that of recognizing and giving voice to this invisible yet present childhood. This movement is also a form of historical justice. It means accepting that history cannot be written solely from the perspective of the powerful, and that the experiences of children, even those less fortunate, are fundamental to understanding the social complexity of any era. The boy from Pompeii, by being rescued from invisibility, helps us question traditional representations of childhood. He invites us to view children not simply as future adults or mere objects of protection, but as subjects of rights and full existence. His story challenges us to consider how society values childhood and how this value can be reflected in social, political, and cultural practices. Another important aspect of this reflection is realizing that the invisibility of childhood throughout history is linked to broader processes of social exclusion. Poor, enslaved, migrant, or marginalized children were often the most invisible. This historical invisibility continues to this day, influencing how these children are viewed and treated. Recovering these stories is, therefore, also an act of recognizing diversity and social complexity. When we remember the boy from Pompeii, we understand that childhood's presence in history is made up of fragments, of traces that require attentive and sensitive listening. Every archaeological trace, every record, however minimal, is an invitation to reconstruct narratives that give meaning to these children's lives. This reconstruction is neither simple nor complete, but it is necessary so that we can broaden our perspective on the past and at the same time on the present. The invisibility of childhood also shows us the importance of memory and cultural preservation. Preserving children's history means valuing childhood as a fundamental moment in human life. It means recognizing that the conditions in which children live profoundly influence the course of history, societies, and cultures. This appreciation involves public policies, education, health, and the creation of spaces where childhood can be recognized in its plurality. The boy from Pompeii, then, symbolizes this childhood that was and is present, even when invisible. He teaches us that the history of childhood is made of tensions between what was recorded and what was silenced, between presence and absence. Recognizing this tension is the first step toward building a more just, inclusive, and sensitive historical narrative. Along this path, it is essential that childhood be understood not only as past, but also as present and future. The lessons we learn from the story of the boy from Pompeii can inspire a collective commitment to ensuring that childhood is protected, respected, and valued. May no child be invisible or forgotten, but may all have their stories heard and their lives recognized. The history of childhood, therefore, is a constant invitation to listen, empathize, and act. An invitation to build societies where the right to a full existence of every child is a priority, where the silence of the past is transformed into a voice for the present and the future. Vulnerability is a condition that, in a more intense and delicate way, marks childhood. The boy from Pompeii reveals the fragility that many children face, a fragility that is not limited to the physical aspect, but extends to social, emotional, and cultural dimensions. Understanding this vulnerability is fundamental to reflecting on the challenges that childhood faces throughout history, and especially today. From the moment of birth, a child depends on a set of care and protection that ensures their healthy development. When this care is lacking, whether due to neglect, abandonment, or adverse social conditions, vulnerability becomes a reality that can forever mark the child's life. The boy from Pompeii, isolated in his death, shows us an extreme example of this vulnerability, but one that, unfortunately, finds echoes in many contemporary stories. Beyond physical dependence, childhood vulnerability also manifests itself in exposure to contexts of violence, social exclusion, poverty, and discrimination. These factors compromise not only survival, but also the full exercise of children's fundamental rights, such as the right to education, health, affection, and social participation. The boy's story calls us to reflect on how societies address these vulnerabilities and what collective responses are available to address them. It's important to emphasize that vulnerability is not a natural and immutable characteristic of childhood, but a condition that can be modified through public policies, community actions, and individual attitudes. Recognizing this possibility is an essential step toward building safe, welcoming environments that promote children's integral development. Therefore, reflecting on vulnerability also means reflecting on our responsibilities as a society. Archaeology and history, by rediscovering the story of the boy from Pompeii, open up space for debates on child vulnerability in different historical contexts. These reflections help us understand that protecting children has always been a challenge, involving not only material aspects, but also cultural, ethical, and political values. Each era responds to these challenges in specific ways, but the urgency of caring for children remains constant. Another important point is to understand that vulnerability can be invisible to many, especially when it comes to children living in marginalized conditions. The Pompeii boy, with his absence of personal belongings and his distant location from other bodies, symbolizes this invisibility. This situation demands greater sensitivity from us to identify risk situations and act preventively, ensuring that no child is left without protection and care. This reflection on vulnerability also leads us to question the social inequalities that directly impact childhood. Children from poor families, peripheral communities, and ethnic or social minorities face more intense and frequent challenges. Vulnerability is intertwined with social injustice, revealing the need for structural actions that promote equity and inclusion. Beyond its social and political dimensions, childhood vulnerability has a profound emotional dimension. Affection, care, and the presence of secure bonds are essential elements for children to overcome adverse situations and develop their identity with emotional health. The boy from Pompeii, even in his lonely death, reminds us of the importance of these bonds, which, when broken, leave painful scars. It is by recognizing this vulnerability that we can build an ethics of childhood based on respect, protection, and the promotion of children's integral well-being. This ethics implies recognizing children as subjects of rights and recognizing that their fragility demands a shared collective responsibility involving the families, communities, institutions, and governments. Ultimately, childhood vulnerability is an invitation to hope. Even in the face of hardship and loss, it is possible to build paths of care, resilience, and social transformation. The memory of the boy from Pompeii inspires us not to give up this fight, to remain vigilant and committed to protecting childhood, so that every child has the chance to live with dignity, safety, and love. By reflecting on vulnerability, we strengthen our commitment to the present and future of children, aware that caring for them is caring for humanity in its purest and most essential form. When we think about childcare, it's inevitable to recognize that responsibility isn't individual, but social. Child protection must be a collective commitment, a priority that permeates all sectors of society and manifests itself in shared attitudes, policies, and values. The story of the boy from Pompeii, so lonely and sad, reminds us of the dramatic consequences when this responsibility isn't assumed. Childhood fundamentally depends on the environment in which the child lives. The family, of course, plays a central role, but it's impossible to separate child protection from the broader context, the community, institutions, and the state. Each of these elements contributes to the formation of a care network, which can be both a safe haven and a space of vulnerability and abandonment. In the case of the Pompeii boy, the absence of personal belongings and his isolated location suggest a serious breakdown in this care network. He was left to his own devices in a time of disaster, without the protection a child should receive. This situation highlights the importance of social and collective responsibility in protecting children, a principle that must be continually reaffirmed and practiced. Social responsibility implies, above all, recognizing children as subjects of rights. This means ensuring that all children have access to dignified living conditions, health, education, food, safety. It also means ensuring that their voices are heard and respected in all spheres of society. Child protection is, therefore, a fundamental right and an indicator of social justice. For this responsibility to be effective, public policies must be aligned with children's needs and implemented in an inclusive and comprehensive manner. This includes investments in health, education, social assistance, and protection against violence. Furthermore, community and family participation is essential to strengthen these policies and ensure they reach those most in need. Civil society also plays a fundamental role. Non-governmental organizations, community groups, and concerned citizens are important actors in building a protective environment for children. These actors can work to defend children's rights, promote social mobilization, and create safe and welcoming spaces. Social responsibility is a joint effort that requires commitment and solidarity. Social responsibility in protecting children also involves educating them about respect and care from the earliest stages of life, teaching new generation about the importance of empathy, respect for differences, and solidarity builds a culture of protecting and valuing childhood. This helps ensure that, in the future, children and adults act as agents of care and advocacy for children's rights. It's important to emphasize that assuming this responsibility is not an act of charity, but a demand for justice and humanity. Every child has the right to grow up in an environment that offers safety, affection, and opportunities to develop their potential. Ensuring this is an ethical and social commitment that reflects the maturity and awareness of a society. The memory of the boy from Pompeii, with his story marked by a lack of care and extreme vulnerability, challenges us not to allow other children to be forgotten or marginalized. It is a call for all of us to assume our role in protecting and caring for children, strengthening the networks that guarantee children's dignity and rights. This social commitment also implies addressing the inequalities that affect childhood. It's not enough to guarantee rights for some children. We must fight so that all children, regardless of their origin, social status, or territory, can live protected and loved. Equity in childhood is a fundamental step toward building a more just and humane society. Ultimately, social responsibility in protecting children is an investment in the future. By caring for children, we are protecting the foundation on which tomorrow is built. Every act of care, every inclusive policy, every gesture of solidarity strengthens the social fabric and contributes to a world where childhood is celebrated and respected. The lesson the boy from Pompeii leaves us is clear. No child should be alone in their vulnerability. Child protection is a collective task, a commitment that must span generations, cultures, and spaces. It is in this way, together, that we will build a more humane, more just, and more compassionate future. Education is one of the most powerful tools for transforming children's lives and ensuring that childhood is fully valued. It's not limited to teaching academic content. Education must be understood as a fundamental space for promoting rights, integral development, and the construction of children's identities. Reflecting on the role of education, therefore, means reflecting on the care and respect we give to children as subjects of rights. In the context of the boy from Pompeii, thinking about education leads us to imagine the opportunities he didn't have, the chance to learn, to play, to develop in a safe and welcoming environment. His story awakens in us the importance of ensuring that all children, regardless of their background or social status, have access to a quality education capable of nurturing their potential and expanding their horizons. Valuing childhood in education begins with recognizing children as protagonists of their own stories. This implies paying close attention to their needs, interests, and uniqueness. It's essential that education be inclusive and respectful of diversity, providing spaces where all children can feel welcomed and valued. In this way, school becomes an environment not only for learning, but also for building identity and self-esteem. Furthermore, education plays a role in promoting respect for children's rights and developing conscientious and compassionate citizens. By incorporating themes such as empathy, human rights, diversity, and citizenship into pedagogical practices, education contributes to the formation of a more just and welcoming society. This is essential so that, in the future, children and young people can defend and value childhood in all its dimensions. It's also important to recognize the role of family and community as fundamental partners in the educational process. Education doesn't happen in isolation. It's the result of a network of relationships involving different actors and spaces. When family, school, and community work together, they expand the possibilities for care and development for children, strengthening their identity and social bonds. The story of the boy from Pompeii, even distant in time and space, reminds us of the need for constant attention to the conditions surrounding childhood. Education can be a bridge to overcome inequalities, offer opportunities, and ensure that every child has access to their rights. Investing in education is investing in the present and future of childhood and society as a whole. Another essential aspect of education is the appreciation of play and children's cultural expressions. Play is not just a playful activity, it is a fundamental element for children's cognitive, social, and emotional development. Culture, in turn, offers symbols, stories, and practices that help build identity and belonging. Recognizing and encouraging these dimensions in education is respecting childhood in its essence. The training of education professionals also deserves emphasis in this process. Teachers and educators need to be prepared to understand the specificities of childhood, recognize their vulnerabilities and potential, and act in a sensitive and inclusive manner. This requires ongoing training policies, professional recognition, and institutional support. Finally, education must be a space of resistance against the multiple forms of violence and exclusion that affect childhood. The school environment must promote safety, respect, and acceptance, combating prejudice, discrimination, and any form of abuse. Ensuring this protection is an essential part of valuing childhood. By considering education as a right and a tool for valuing childhood, we reaffirm our commitment to a world where all children can grow up with dignity, opportunity, and love. The boy from Pompeii, even in his absence, inspires us to view childhood with respect and care, recognizing its fundamental importance in building a more humane and compassionate society. As we reach the end of this journey through the history of childhood, guided by the silent presence of the boy from Pompeii, we are invited to look beyond the stones and ruins the shadows of the past and the gaps in the records. We are called to place children at the center of history, recognizing their existence as a fundamental right and a collective responsibility that transcends the limits of time and space. Childhood, often invisible, fragile, and forgotten, proves vital to understanding humanity at its core. By studying their lives, their challenges, their pains, and their joys, we have the opportunity to reclaim a forgotten part of history, the one that speaks of the hope, vulnerability, and strength that only childhood possesses. The boy from Pompeii reminds us that, even when forgotten or silenced, children's stories have the power to touch the present and transform the future. This reflection leads us to take an active stance in the reality that surrounds us, recognizing children's vulnerability, understanding the role of education, and assuming social responsibility in protecting children are attitudes that reflect an ethical and humanitarian commitment. These are necessary steps for childhood to cease being an abstract concept and become a daily practice of care, respect, and appreciation. Along the way, we've seen that childhood is a plural and diverse experience, marked by tensions between invisibility and presence, fragility and resistance, exclusion and inclusion. This complexity challenges us to build narratives and policies that not only recognize, but also affirm children as protagonists of their own stories. Only then can we ensure that every boy and girl has the opportunity to grow up in an environment that fosters their integral development, dignity, and happiness. The boy from Pompeii, even in his silence, is an urgent call for us not to repeat the mistakes of the past. He challenges us to build a society where no child is left behind, where the right to childhood is respected as a sacred and inalienable right. This construction requires commitment, dialogue, and solidarity from everyone: families, educators, government officials, communities, and citizens. But this story, though touching and revealing, is just one among many that make up the vast tapestry of childhood throughout history. Every child, in every time and place, carries with them a unique narrative, capable of illuminating previously unseen aspects of the human condition and the challenges we face. That's why our attentive and careful gaze cannot stop here. The next story will uncover promises to reveal another side of childhood, a story that challenges our perceptions and broadens our understanding of the emotional bonds and safety nets that surround children in times of crisis. A narrative that will make us reflect on resilience and the transformative power of affection in the face of adversity. Prepare yourself, because as you embark on this new journey, you'll find more than just costumes and archaeological remains. You'll find lessons of humanity, courage, and hope that echo through the centuries, touching our present and inspiring our future. This is the invitation we leave you to continue exploring, questioning, and valuing childhood in all its dimensions, knowing that, in doing so, we are building a more just, more human, and more supportive world for all generations to come.